Rite Aid survived 63 years. It survived 2 bankruptcies, the opioid crisis, and a global pandemic. In October 2025, the last store closed for good. But one thing made it out alive, and it was the ice cream. If you grew up in America any time between the 1960s and the early 2000s, there was a good chance you had a Rite Aid within a few miles of your house. Not a glamorous place, not somewhere you planned a trip to. It was just there, the way certain things are just there. The parking lot with the faded lines, the automatic doors that opened a half-second too slow, the smell of floor cleaner and something faintly medicinal that hit you the moment you walked in. You went there when you had a cold. You went there to pick up a prescription your doctor called in. You went there the night before a birthday because you forgot to buy a card. You grabbed a bag of chips on the way to the register and told yourself you needed them. You knew exactly which aisle had the cough drops and exactly where the photo counter used to be before they took it out. For millions of Americans, Rite Aid was not a destination. It was a fact of life. It was the store that was open when other stores weren't, that filled your prescriptions without asking too many questions, that stocked everything you needed for a Tuesday afternoon when nothing was going wrong, but nothing was quite right either. And if you grew up in California, Arizona, Nevada, or anywhere across the American Southwest, Rite Aid had one more thing that no other pharmacy chain could offer. At the back of the store, past the vitamins and the seasonal displays and the clearance bins, there was an ice cream counter. And that ice cream had a name that meant something. Thrifty. A single scoop pressed into a cone by a cylindrical metal tool that produced a perfect round column of ice cream, not a round ball like everywhere else, but a cylinder, clean and exact. Strawberry, chocolate malted crunch, rainbow sherbet. The price was so low for so long that parents didn't think twice. Kids didn't ask twice. You just got the ice cream. It was part of what going to the drugstore meant. That world is gone now. In October 2025, the last Rite Aid locations closed their doors. 63 years of daily American life, prescriptions, birthday cards, cold medicine, last-minute school supplies, quietly shut down for good. The company filed for bankruptcy not once, but twice, and the second time there was no coming back. But here is the part that nobody expected. Here is the part that changes this from just another story about a company that fell behind. The ice cream survived. While the rest of Rite Aid was sold off and shut down, the Thrifty Ice Cream brand was purchased separately, pulled out of the wreckage, and given a second life. Today you can still find it in grocery stores across the Southwest. The cylindrical scoop still exists. The flavors are still the same. The carton looks exactly the way it always did. The pharmacy is gone. But the thing that made the pharmacy feel like home, somehow against all odds, is still here. This is the story of how that happened. And it is a much stranger story than it looks. In 1962, most Americans got their prescriptions filled at a drugstore that looked the same in every city. A pharmacist behind a high counter. A few aisles of aspirin and cough syrup. Maybe a soda fountain near the back where a teenager could sit on a spinning stool and order something cold for 30 cents. These stores were comfortable, familiar, and almost entirely without competition. The pharmacist knew your name. He knew your doctor. He had probably known your parents. And because of that, because there was nowhere else to go, the prices were whatever the owner decided they should be. That is the world Alex Grass walked into. Grass was a lawyer by training, which meant he understood contracts, leverage, and the distance between what something costs and what someone can be made to pay for it. He was not a pharmacist. He had no particular attachment to the traditions of the industry. What he had was a simple observation. Ordinary Americans were paying too much for things they had no choice but to buy. Medicine was not a luxury. It was not something you could decide to skip. And yet the people selling it were operating as if their customers had nowhere else to turn, which, at the time, they didn't, until Grass decided to give them somewhere. In 1962, he opened a small store in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He called it Thrifty Discount Center. The name was not subtle. That was the point. No marble countertops, no white-coated prestige, just a clean store with honest prices and a layout that made sense to a working person who came in tired and needed to leave quickly with what they came for. He priced things lower than the competition, not as a promotion, not as a seasonal sale, as a permanent philosophy. The idea was radical in a way that sounds almost strange today, that a pharmacy could just charge less, consistently, and that people would notice and come back. They noticed. They came back. Within a few years, the Thrift D stores were expanding across Pennsylvania. By 1968, Grass had renamed the company Rite Aid, a name that was almost aggressively plain. The right aid, the right help, at the right price, no flourish, no promise of luxury, just the suggestion that what you needed, you could actually afford to get. By the end of the 1960s, Rite Aid had over 100 locations. By the 1980s, it was one of the largest pharmacy chains in the United States. Alex Grass had built something enormous, not by reinventing the drugstore, but by doing the same thing everyone else was doing, only cheaper and faster and with the quiet confidence of a man who believed that the customer deserved a better deal. For a while, that was enough. For a long while, actually. But a company built on low prices and high volume is a company that always needs to keep growing. The moment it stops expanding, the math starts working against it, and the math, eventually, always wins. To understand what Rite Aid eventually became, and what it lost, you have to travel back further and further west to a story that had nothing to do with Alex Grass. In 1919, a man named Harry Boren opened a small drugstore in Los Angeles. He called it Thrifty Drugstores. The name, like Grass's name 40 years later, said exactly what it meant. Low prices, no pretense. A clean store in a city that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. For the first 2 decades, Thrifty was unremarkable in all the ways that make a local business survive. It filled prescriptions. It stocked aspirin and witch hazel and bandages and all the things that a family needed to keep itself functional. It grew slowly, the way honest businesses tend to grow. 1 store, then 3, then 10, then 20, each one looking roughly like the last. But in 1940, Thrifty did something that no one expected to define the company for the next 80 years. It started making its own ice cream, not buying from a supplier, not partnering with an existing brand, making it in its own facility with its own recipes for its own stores. The flavors were not complicated: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. A few rotating specials that came and went with the seasons. But the price was something that stopped people on the sidewalk. 5 cents a scoop. In 1940 and for decades afterward, 5 cents was the kind of number that made a parent say yes without thinking about it. The scoop itself was the detail that people remembered longest. Thrifty did not use the round metal scoop that every other ice cream counter in America used. They used a cylinder, a long metal tube with a plunger inside that pushed a perfect column of ice cream directly into the cone. Clean, fast, exact. The shape was unlike anything else, and because of that, it became the shape that a generation of children in Southern California associated with the specific pleasure of getting what they wanted. You knew you were getting a thrifty scoop before the ice cream even touched your tongue. The shape told you. The shape was the brand. By the 1960s, thrifty drugstores had expanded across California and into neighboring states. The ice cream had traveled with it, loyally, the way certain things travel when they are attached to memory rather than just to commerce. You did not go to Thrifty for the ice cream because it was the best ice cream in the world. You went because it was your ice cream, because your mother had taken you, and her mother had taken her, and the price was still so low that it felt almost like a gift every single time. By the 1980s, Thrifty had more than 500 locations. The ice cream counter was in nearly every one of them. Children stood in line in Phoenix and Las Vegas and Portland and Tucson, pointing at the flavors through the glass, asking for chocolate malted crunch, in the same voice that children had been using to ask for it since before their parents were born. It was, by any measure, one of the most quietly successful regional brands in American history. Not famous outside the Southwest, not discussed in business schools, just deeply, stubbornly, completely embedded in the daily life of the people who grew up near it. That kind of loyalty is not built by marketing. It is built by repetition, by the same experience, reliably delivered across enough years that it stops being a transaction and becomes something closer to a ritual. And rituals, as it turns out, are very hard to kill, even when everything around them is falling apart. By the mid-1990s, Rite Aid was one of the biggest pharmacy chains in the eastern United States. Alex Grass had built something that worked, reliably, profitably, year after year. But the company had a problem that success tends to create. It had run out of easy places to grow. The East was saturated. Every mid-sized city between Maine and Florida already had a Rite Aid or was about to get one. To keep expanding, and a company like Rite Aid always had to keep expanding, it needed to go west. But going west meant competing directly with chains that had been there for decades, that had the locations, the relationships, and the name recognition that take a generation to build. There was a faster way. In 1996, Rite Aid acquired Thrifty Payless, the merged successor to the original Thrifty drugstores, for $2.3 billion. It was the largest acquisition in the company's history. Overnight, Rite Aid went from being a regional player to a national one. More than 1,000 new stores, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona. The western half of the country opened up in a single transaction. On paper, it was a masterstroke. The kind of deal that gets written up in business journals and used as a case study for how to scale quickly in a fragmented market. The numbers made sense. The geography made sense. The logic was clean. What no one spent much time talking about, what no spreadsheet captured, was the ice cream. Because tucked inside that $2.3 billion deal, listed somewhere in the fine print among the pharmacy licenses and the real estate leases and the distribution agreements, was the Thrifty Ice Cream brand, the cylindrical scoop, the 5-cent legacy. The thing that several million people in the American Southwest had grown up treating as a permanent feature of their world, as reliable as the weather and as familiar as their own kitchen. Rite Aid became the custodian of something it had not created and perhaps did not fully understand. It installed ice cream counters in hundreds of its newly acquired Western locations. It kept the Thrifty name on the cartons. It kept the cylindrical scoop. It kept the prices low enough that the ritual could continue. Children standing in line, pointing through glass, asking for chocolate malted crunch in the same voice children had always used. And for a while, it worked. Customers who had grown up with Thrifty walked into what was now technically a Rite Aid and found the thing they had come for right where it had always been. The name above the door had changed. The ice cream had not. But $2.3 billion is a significant amount of debt to carry. And carrying significant debt requires everything else to go right. The store traffic, the prescription volume, the margins, the competition, the regulatory environment, the broader economy. Everything. And as the 1990s ended and the 2000s began, not everything was going right, not even close. Every company that fails has a moment, usually more than one, where the outcome could have gone differently. A decision that could have been made sooner, a competitor that could have been taken more seriously, a warning that came clearly and was set aside anyway. Rite Aid had all of these, and it had three enemies that arrived not all at once, but in sequence, each one finding the company a little weaker than the last. The first enemy was competition, not the kind that sneaks up on you, but the kind that builds slowly in plain sight until one day you look up and realize the ground has shifted. CVS and Walgreens had been growing alongside Rite Aid for decades. They had the same basic model: prescriptions, household goods, convenient locations, but they had executed it with more discipline, more capital, and more willingness to adapt. While Rite Aid was absorbing the debt from the Thrifty Payless acquisition and trying to integrate more than 1,000 new stores into its operations, CVS was building its own pharmacy benefit management company. It was inserting itself directly between patients and their insurance plans, locking in customers at a level that had nothing to do with which store was closer or which had better prices. Walgreens was expanding its store count with a speed and a funding advantage that Rite Aid simply could not match. Rite Aid was fighting for the same customer in the same neighborhoods with less money and a heavier debt load. That is a difficult position in any industry. In pharmacy retail, where margins are thin and volume is everything, it was almost impossible to sustain. The second enemy arrived from a direction that nobody in the pharmacy business had fully anticipated. Amazon began offering prescription delivery, not immediately and not all at once, but steadily, methodically, in the way that Amazon tends to enter markets. First, the convenience, then the price, then the habit. Customers who had driven to Rite Aid twice a month for years found that they didn't need to anymore. The prescription came to them. The front-of-store products, the cold medicine and the shampoo and the seasonal candy, could be ordered from the same place. The trip itself became optional. And once a habit becomes optional, it tends to quietly disappear. But the third enemy was the one that decided the outcome. And it was not a competitor. It was history. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, opioid painkillers moved through American communities with a speed and a scale that the healthcare system was not equipped to slow. Pharmacies were not the origin of the crisis, but they were the final point of distribution, the place where the prescription became the pill. And as the lawsuits began to accumulate, from states, from counties, from cities, from families, the pharmacy chains found themselves named as defendants in a legal reckoning that had no clear ceiling. By the early 2000s, Rite Aid was facing more than 1,600 individual lawsuits related to its role in filling opioid prescriptions. The settlements were enormous. The legal costs on top of the settlements were enormous. And beneath all of it, a balance sheet that was already strained from decades of thin margins and heavy debt was being asked to absorb losses that no pharmacy chain could have fully prepared for. The numbers told the story plainly. In October 2023, Rite Aid filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At the time of filing, the company carried nearly $4 billion in debt. It had closed hundreds of stores in the years leading up to the filing. The workforce had been cut again and again. The executive team had changed multiple times. Every restructuring that was supposed to stabilize the company had bought time without fixing the underlying problem. $4 billion, 1,600 lawsuits, two major competitors with deeper pockets and better positioning. and an entire generation of customers who had quietly learned to get their prescriptions delivered to their door. The company that Alex Grass had built on the simple idea that ordinary people deserved a fair price for their medicine was now drowning in the consequences of decisions made across decades, some its own, some the industry's, some belonging to a healthcare system that had failed in ways far larger than any single pharmacy chain. The first bankruptcy was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end, and everyone by then could see it. Bankruptcy in the American business system is not always the end. It is sometimes a tool, a legal mechanism designed to give a company the space to reset, to renegotiate, to cut away the weight that has been pulling it under and try again with a lighter load. Some of the most recognizable names in American commerce have passed through Chapter 11 and emerged on the other side. Smaller, leaner, but still standing. General Motors, Delta Airlines, Macy's. The list is long enough that bankruptcy carries, in certain circles, almost no stigma at all. When Rite Aid filed in October 2023, there were people who believed this could be one of those stories. The company had real assets. It still had thousands of locations in communities that depended on them. Smaller towns and urban neighborhoods where Rite Aid was not just convenient, but was, in many cases, the only pharmacy within a reasonable distance. It had pharmacists who knew their patients by name, who had been filling the same prescriptions for the same families for 20 years. It had a brand that, despite everything, still meant something to the people who had grown up with it. The bankruptcy process moved forward. Hundreds of stores were closed, locations that had been underperforming for years, and that the restructuring gave the company legal cover to exit quickly. Leases were renegotiated, debt was reduced. The legal team worked through the opioid settlements, painful and expensive as they were, and brought them to resolution. The workforce shrank again, significantly, and the people who remained understood that the version of the company they were working for was a smaller and more precarious thing than it had once been. But they were still there. The stores were still open. The pharmacies were still filling prescriptions. In September 2024, Rite Aid announced that it had successfully emerged from bankruptcy. The debt had been cut by more than $2 billion. The store count had been reduced to something more manageable. The executive team spoke about focus, about a company that had learned from its mistakes and was now positioned to compete in a more disciplined way. The language was careful and measured, the way language always is when a company is trying to project confidence it is not entirely sure it has earned. People wanted to believe it. Not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of the particular hope that attaches itself to familiar things. The pharmacist who had been coming in every morning for 30 years wanted to believe it. The customer who had been picking up her blood pressure medication at the same counter for a decade wanted to believe it. Even the competitors, in a way, wanted to believe it. Because a market without Rite Aid was a market that would need to be redistributed, and redistribution is always complicated and expensive. But the economics had not changed in the ways that mattered. The competition from CVS and Walgreens had not softened. Amazon's pharmacy business had not retreated. The customer habits that had been quietly shifting for years toward delivery, toward convenience, toward not making the trip at all, had not reversed. The stores that remained were operating in a landscape that was fundamentally hostile to the model they were built on. And the debt reduction, significant as it was, had not produced the new revenue streams or the operational efficiencies that would have been needed to make the numbers work going forward. 8 months after emerging from bankruptcy, Rite Aid filed for Chapter 11 again. The second filing was different from the first in one important way. There was no language about restructuring this time, no talk of emerging leaner and more focused. The second filing was a liquidation, a legal acknowledgement that the business, as a going concern, was finished. The stores would close, The assets would be sold. The name would be retired. By October 2025, almost exactly 2 years after the first bankruptcy filing, the last Rite Aid locations shut their doors. The pharmacies transferred their patient records. The employees cleared out their lockers. The signs came down. 63 years, 2 bankruptcy filings, and an end so quiet that many of the people who had shopped there for decades only found out when they drove to the parking lot and saw the paper in the windows. When a company goes through liquidation, everything gets sorted. The real estate, the pharmacy licenses, the inventory, the brand names, the equipment. Everything that was once part of a single operating business gets separated, appraised, and sold to whoever is willing to pay for it. It is a methodical process, and mostly an unglamorous one. Accountants and lawyers working through spreadsheets, creditors waiting for their portion of whatever is left. In Rite Aid's case, most of what was left went to other pharmacy operators, real estate investors, and the various parties who had claims against the bankruptcy estate. The pharmacy business, the prescriptions, the patient records, the licenses, was absorbed by competitors. The store locations were sold or simply vacated. The corporate infrastructure was dismantled, and then, separately, quietly, almost as a footnote to the larger proceedings, the ice cream was sold. The Thrifty Ice Cream brand was purchased by an entity called Hillrod Holdings for $19.2 million. The name Hillrod Holdings meant nothing to most people, but the people behind it were not strangers to the consumer business. The partnership was tied to senior figures from Monster Beverage Corporation, the company behind Monster Energy, one of the best-selling energy drink brands in the world, headquartered in Corona, California. On the surface, it is an unusual pairing. Monster Energy is loud. It is built on extreme sports and aggressive marketing and a brand identity that runs entirely on electricity and velocity. Thrifty Ice Cream is quiet. It is built on cylindrical scoops and 50-cent nostalgia and the specific tranquility of a Tuesday afternoon in 1968. The two things do not obviously belong in the same sentence. But the people behind Hillrod Holdings understood something that the bankruptcy proceedings had made unusually visible. They understood that the ice cream was not, at its core, a product. It was a container for memory. There were people in their 50s and 60s across California and Arizona and Nevada and Oregon who had a response to the sight of that carton that had nothing to do with rational consumer preference. Who could tell you, without hesitating, exactly which flavor they had ordered on a specific afternoon 40 years ago? Who had taken their own children to the thrifty counter the way their parents had taken them, and who had watched their children point through the same glass case toward the same flavors and ask in the same voice? That kind of brand loyalty cannot be manufactured from scratch. It takes generations to accumulate, and it belongs, in the end, not to the company, but to the people who carried it with them. The company is just the custodian. And when one custodian fails, the loyalty does not disappear. It waits. Hillrod Holdings intended to be the next custodian. The terms of the sale preserved what mattered. The cylindrical scoop, that specific metal tool that had produced a specific shape of ice cream for 80 years, stayed. The classic flavors stayed. The packaging stayed close enough to what it had always been that someone who had not bought a carton in 20 years could still walk past it in a grocery store and recognize it immediately, the way you recognize a song from the first 3 notes. Today, Thrifty Ice Cream is sold in Vons and Albertsons locations across the western United States. It is no longer behind the pharmacy counter. It is in the freezer aisle, between the other brands, without a soda fountain and without a linoleum floor and without the particular fluorescent light of a drugstore at 2 in the afternoon. The context has changed completely. But the ice cream is the same. And for a certain kind of person in a certain part of the country, that is enough. That is more than enough. $19.2 million for a brand, for a flavor, for a cylindrical scoop, and 80 years of someone's childhood. It sounds like a strange price to put on something so personal. But then again, the things that survive longest are rarely the things that made the most business sense. They are the things that meant something to people. The things that people carried with them after everything else was gone. There is a version of this story that ends simply with a business failure. The numbers were wrong. The debt was too heavy. The competition was too fast. That version is accurate, and it is also incomplete because it does not ask the question that is harder to answer. Could any of it have been different? Not the opioid crisis. That was larger than any single company, but the rest of it. If Rite Aid had moved into prescription delivery 5 years earlier, before Amazon made the trip optional, if the Thrifty Payless acquisition had come with less debt and more patience, integrating 1,000 stores takes years, not quarters. If the company had looked at what made the Western stores different from the Eastern ones, not just the geography, but the culture, the loyalty, the ice cream counter that people drove past 3 other pharmacies to reach, and asked what that was worth, and built around it instead of standardizing over it. These are not hypotheticals with clean answers. Companies operating at that scale, under that kind of debt pressure, do not have the luxury of long-term thinking. Every quarter demands a response. Every creditor demands a number. The decisions that look obvious in hindsight are rarely obvious when you are inside them, but it is worth sitting with the question. Because the ice cream survived precisely because someone, eventually, asked it. Someone looked at what remained of a 63-year-old company and identified the one asset that had outlasted every strategic mistake, not because it was the most profitable thing Rite Aid owned, but because it was the most loved. And they paid $19 million for that love and bet that it would carry forward. That bet is still being made. The brand is in grocery stores now. The context has changed. Whether the loyalty travels with it, whether a cylindrical scoop of strawberry ice cream means the same thing in a Vons freezer aisle as it did behind a pharmacy counter in 1987, is a question that only time will answer. But the things that people mourn are rarely rational. They mourn the pharmacist who knew their name. They mourn the greeting card aisle on a Sunday morning. They mourn the small good thing at the end of a necessary errand, the low price that felt, for as long as it lasted, like a small act of generosity from a world that did not always feel generous. Rite Aid is gone. The freezer hums on. And somewhere in the western United States right now, a child is pointing at a carton that says Thrifty, asking for chocolate malted crunch. The parent says yes without thinking. The child does not know the history, does not know about the bankruptcies, the lawsuits, the 63 years, the $19 million, does not know they are holding a survivor. They just know it is the ice cream and that it is good. So, here is what we want to ask you. Do you remember your drugstore? The specific one, from when you were a kid or when you were raising kids? What do you remember about it? And if you grew up in the Southwest, did you have the ice cream? Do you remember what it tasted like? Tell us below, because some things are worth remembering out loud.